It was, about a decade ago or so that I picked up a book of sermons by Austin Farrer. Now, for those of you not familiar with him, Farrer was a priest, theologian, and philosopher who spent most of his career at Oxford until his death in 1968. The day I bought this book, I had not heard of Austin Farrer. I bought it because I like good sermons, and so I assumed these would be good because they were published in a book. They were. The sermon that particularly stuck with me, though, is titled Double Thinking. Farrer opens by telling those listening that 2 nights previously he had been persuaded to take part in a public verbal match with what he called an unbelieving philosopher. Now, Farrer's role was to defend religion and theology, and the unbelieving philosopher's role was to attack it. As both sides were convinced of their own stance, neither side achieved a kill, as Farrer put it. And as both sides had heard all the arguments before, neither had any need to get very excited, which means only that neither side much cared what the other had to say. But later, Farrer found himself convinced that he needed to take seriously what his unbelieving philosopher colleague was thinking, because there must be, he posited, something or much in our teaching about Christianity and our living of it which is at fault if good people can react in total disbelief of God. And so Farrer's sermon takes on one prevalent accusation against Christianity, the accusation of double thinking. The accusation goes like this: Christians think they believe, but they deceive themselves, because they in fact have 2 systems of thought: religious thinking and practical thinking. In the Christian's practical thinking, he or she thinks like the unbelievers think, which obviously means that God is not taken into account and life is not embraced or truly experienced as being God involved. Therefore, their religious thinking is no more than an idea, a fantasy, not something real. It is an amiable and harmless hypocrisy. Now, Farrer faces this accusation honestly, even painfully, and tries to answer the questions: does this criticism have merit? And if so, how do we force the 2 ways of thinking together? Because Christian hypocrisy is not amiable nor harmless, not for the Christian, not for the church, not for the world. Now, we heard today 2 passages that I think might explain the prevalence of double thinking among we Christians. Isaiah presents a visually stunning song, really, about new heavens and a new earth in which all has been reconciled to good. All the people are a delight. There is no distress, no need for tears. There is no homelessness, no hunger. Enemies in former days are easy companions in this new day. And God is happy, and the people are happy with God. Now, mostly we have come to consider this a vision of the hereafter. But if we don't, we often maybe privately scoff and say it is not realistic, it is not possible, it is no more than an infantile dream. In both cases, it is the hereafter or it is an infantile dream. Isaiah's poetry can be and is ignored for having no bearing on our actual lives and our actual world. And so we Christians can, and we often do, engage in double thinking. We compartmentalize our religion for religious observances or pleas for God's help, and the rest of the time we are often quite indiscernible from the non-believer. But perhaps the Christian who is fully committed to God's purposes and Christ's teachings, thinks less about what is already done and more about how their life can live out Isaiah's vision now. In verse 17, Isaiah says, I am about to create. In verse 18, Isaiah says, I am creating. The ambiguity suggests that God's kingdom here is both not yet and yet. We Christians, too, are both not yet and yet in terms of faith and commitment, and I suspect Farrer might say that our desire should be, if we love Christ, to be always moving toward yet. Now, in the reading from Luke's Gospel, we are presented with a very different picture. Jesus speaks of calamity, wars and insurrections, earthquakes, famines, and plagues, the destruction of the temple. Admittedly, in our day, these are things that we simply take for granted as rising up in our world from time to time. But Jesus goes on to say that his true followers, they will know other very personal catastrophes. They will be imprisoned and persecuted. They will be betrayed even by those they love. They will be hated by many. And while many of us could admire those who have suffered in such a way for the sake of Christ and God's good, and are grateful that Jesus suffered in such a way, the vast majority of us would prefer to avoid these calamities. And we do so by having one set of thoughts in our worship observances, for example, and another set of thoughts the rest of the time. We have one foot in and one foot out, content with being not yet and yet. Now, I wish the lectionary had appointed the 4 verses that precede the reading we heard from Luke today. I think they matter to what follows. Those verses tell of the widow whose offering to the treasury was very meager in comparison to the offerings being made by her more affluent neighbors. Jesus does not say that the widow gave the same proportion or even a greater proportion of her wealth as the wealthy were given of theirs. Jesus says she gave all that she had. And it is at that point that some of the followers are admiring the opulence of the temple, its material splendor, the obvious affluence that created it, having missed the spiritual counsel offered by Jesus just moments before. Do not be impressed by material things or man-made splendor or power. Be impressed only by God and be willing to give all to God. This widow lived her religion. She lived her love of God, and she lived her trust in God. For those who give all that they have, all that they are to God, Jesus says these will be able to endure catastrophe. These will be abundantly aided by God. These will be able to act for the good of God's kingdom and for the good of others. Isaiah, throughout the book of Isaiah, and Jesus were both preoccupied with the religious hypocrisy and lukewarm faith that Austin Farrer wrestled with at the hands of an unbelieving philosopher. They both also tell of calamity, and both also tell of the redeeming acts of God that take place in and after calamity. No one goes through life without it on a very personal level or a broader level affecting many. But in those times that seem hopeless, at the very least scary, certainly so painful, that they twist the mind and heart with the questions, what on earth happened? Why on earth did it happen? My God, is this the final word? God answers by countering it for the good. In fact, God's mightiest deeds have come through catastrophic events. Walk through the pages of the Bible. Not even the creation story in Genesis is free from calamity at a cosmic, if not human, level. God separated the waters from the waters, and the waters from the land, and the light from the darkness. And this was no tender teasing apart. Science calls it the Big Bang, not the gentle puff. A big part of how God counters catastrophe for good is by sending us out into it. People, too, know their mightiest actions in the face of catastrophe. Read any book of history from any time and place, and you will find them. Read anything about any of the true saints, those beatified and those not beatified, but remembered, for giving all that they had to God to stand in the way of wrong. In these times, in their actions, they could see less dimly that new earth, and they believed, and they acted in love and in faith. They endured, and they trusted, and there was no double thinking about it. Austin Farrer ended his sermon with this counsel for us, a way forward to healing the division within us, in our thinking, in our living fully Christian lives, a counsel that should not wait for catastrophe to be acted upon and must not be ignored when catastrophe strikes. I quote from the final paragraph of Farrer's sermon. You can live your religion if you like. You can know the reality of God if you like. For God will rejoice to assist and infinitely over-reward whatever effort you will make. Resolution is the crucial point. That is the link by which religious contemplation passes into practical action. From your prayers form simple resolutions, not like the absurd resolutions of New Year's Day, resolutions for the next 12 months, but resolutions for the next 12 hours. Make them few enough to be practicable, and obey them for the sake of God Himself. If you break them, repeat and renew them. What does God ask of me is a part of every sincere prayer. By resolutions kept, we turn religious fantasy into the substance of living. By resolutions broken, we learn our weakness and are driven back to God. By resolutions renewed and kept, we learn to live by Him who says, "My strength is made perfect in weakness, and my grace is sufficient for thee." Amen.